On August 7, 1944, Germany launched its last armored gamble in Normandy. 4 panzer divisions, nearly 200 tanks, and veteran commanders were ordered to cut the American breakout and restore a collapsing front. On paper, the plan made sense. In reality, it was already dead. Clear skies meant Allied air power, and Allied air power meant paralysis. What followed was not a clash of tanks, but a demonstration of modern war, where movement required permission from the sky, and permission was never granted. This story isn't about bravery or tactics. It's about systems, production, and why Germany's armor died in daylight. Subscribe to No Man's Land for unapologetic military history focused on power, logistics, and consequences. By early August 1944, the German front in Normandy was already cracking. Operation Cobra had torn a hole through the western sector, and American armored units were pouring into open country. The war of hedgerows was ending. The war of movement had begun, and Germany was losing it. Hitler's response was immediate and absolute. He ordered a counterattack to sever the American corridor to the coast. The objective was Avranches, the narrow gateway through which General Patton's Third Army was flooding into France. If that gateway could be cut, the breakout could be reversed, and the front restored. Panzer Group West was tasked with the operation. Under General Hans Eberbach, 4 armored divisions were assembled. Veteran units pulled together from across Normandy. On paper, the force was formidable. Nearly 200 operational tanks and tens of thousands of experienced troops. The plan demanded speed, concentration, and uninterrupted movement. Eberbach knew the problem immediately. The attack was ordered for daylight. The weather forecast predicted clear skies. In Normandy, clear skies meant Allied air supremacy. Fighter bombers roamed freely, waiting for armored movement. Eberbach objected. He argued for delay, for night movement, for caution. The response from Berlin was final. Advance immediately. This was not a tactical disagreement. It was a clash between battlefield reality and ideological command. Hitler believed willpower could override material conditions. He believed aggressive action could compensate for structural weakness. Eberbach understood that tanks moving in daylight without air cover were targets, not weapons. Despite this, preparations continued. Orders were issued. Timetables were fixed. At dawn on August 7th, German armor began moving west through narrow Norman roads, hedgerows closing in on both sides. The advance initially caught American units off guard. Gains were made. Momentum seemed possible. But the sky remained empty only briefly. What followed would expose a truth the German army could no longer ignore. In 1944, armored warfare did not begin on the ground. It began in the air. The German plan depended on movement. Armor had to advance rapidly along a limited road network, punch through American positions, and reach Avranches before the Allies could react. In earlier wars, this would have been plausible. In Normandy, in 1944, it was fatal. The terrain dictated everything. The bocage hedgerows that had slowed Allied advances now worked against the Germans. Tanks could not maneuver freely off-road. Columns were forced onto narrow lanes, compressing vehicles into long, predictable formations. From the ground, these routes felt concealed. From the air, they were unmistakable. Clear weather transformed the battlefield instantly. Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted the movement within minutes. The German advance was no longer a maneuver. It was a signal flare. Once detected, the response did not depend on improvisation or heroics. It depended on a pre-built system designed for exactly this scenario. Allied fighter bombers were already forward-based, armed, fueled, and waiting. The moment German armor moved, it triggered a chain reaction. Reports flowed from spotters to air control centers. Squadrons were assigned targets before the first German units had reached their objectives. This was the core asymmetry. German armor required hours to assemble and coordinate. Allied air power required minutes to respond. The Germans were still advancing under the assumption that air attack would be intermittent. They were wrong. The first strikes did not annihilate entire units. They did something far more effective. They disrupted timing. Vehicles stopped. Crews scattered. Commanders lost cohesion. Radio traffic spiked as units attempted to reorient under fire. Momentum vanished. Every pause made the situation worse. Stopped columns were easier to target. Dispersed units lost mutual support. Attempts to conceal vehicles invited repeated attacks as soon as movement resumed. The battlefield became a trap where motion attracted destruction and stillness invited encirclement. German doctrine had been built around speed, shock, and concentration. Allied air power neutralized all three simultaneously. Tanks could no longer mass. Attacks could not maintain tempo. Commanders could not control formations under constant aerial pressure. By mid-morning, the advance was already faltering, not because German crews lacked skill or courage, but because the conditions required for armored warfare no longer existed. The sky had become an active participant in the battle, and it belonged entirely to the Allies. The Allied aircraft over Mortain were not improvising. They were executing doctrine. By 1944, air-ground coordination in Normandy had evolved into a continuous strike loop. Detect, assign, attack, assess, repeat. The aircraft themselves were only one component of a larger mechanism. The Hawker Typhoon embodied this system. It was fast at low altitude, heavily armed, and designed for one purpose: destroying ground targets. 8 rockets per aircraft, cannons for follow-up passes, and pilots trained specifically to hunt armor. Against German tanks, direct hits were devastating. Near misses were often enough. Blast effects damaged tracks, engines, and exposed crews. Mobility, not destruction, was the priority. But the true lethality of the Typhoon came from repetition. Squadrons did not attack once and disappear. They cycled. Launch, strike, return, rearm, and launch again. Turnaround times measured in minutes, not hours. This transformed air power from a supporting arm into a persistent presence. German crews experienced this as a continuous threat. Even brief movement triggered attacks. Tanks that survived the first strike rarely survived the second or third. Crews began to abandon vehicles at the sound of aircraft engines. Units dispersed into hedgerows, sacrificing cohesion to survive. This was not accidental. Allied planners understood that breaking formations was more valuable than tallying kills. A tank immobilized without fuel or ammunition was functionally destroyed. A division forced to halt was defeated, even if many vehicles remained intact. The German army had no counter to this system. Anti-aircraft guns were scarce, poorly positioned, and quickly suppressed. The Luftwaffe was absent. Radio coordination between ground and air was minimal or non-existent. German doctrine had never adapted to sustained air dominance by the enemy. By late morning, German commanders were no longer planning advances. They were reacting to airstrikes. Orders shifted from movement to concealment, from exploitation to survival. The battlefield no longer belonged to the side with the better tanks or tactics. It belonged to the side that controlled the rhythm of engagement. At Mortain, that rhythm was set from the air. And once it began, it did not stop. By early afternoon, the German counterattack no longer resembled an offensive operation. It had fractured into isolated pockets of armor, infantry, and command elements struggling to exist under constant aerial pressure. Tanks were still present on the battlefield, but their purpose had changed. They were no longer instruments of maneuver. They were liabilities. The destruction unfolding west of Mortain was not defined by burning wrecks alone. Many German tanks remained physically intact, yet completely ineffective. Tracks were damaged. Engines overheated or seized. Optics shattered. Radios destroyed. Crews wounded or killed by concussion. Vehicles that could still fire could no longer move. Vehicles that could move lacked fuel or ammunition. This distinction mattered. German doctrine depended on concentration and tempo. Panzer divisions were designed to punch through weak points and exploit chaos. Air power removed both conditions. Tanks could not mass without being detected. Attempts to regroup invited immediate attack. Every effort to restore momentum simply exposed more targets. Logistical vehicles suffered even worse. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and command vehicles were far more vulnerable than tanks, and far more critical. When they burned, entire formations became inert. Infantry units were stranded. Commanders lost control. Even undamaged tanks were rendered irrelevant within hours. German crews adapted instinctively. They camouflaged vehicles with foliage. They dispersed into hedgerows. They moved only in short bursts. But these measures only slowed destruction. The moment a tank repositioned, aircraft returned. The moment a column reformed, it was attacked again. The battlefield became a paradox. To advance was to die. To stop was to be bypassed, isolated, or destroyed later. Armor had become defensive, reactive, and ultimately static. This was the fundamental shift of 1944. Tanks had once dictated the flow of battle. At Mortain, they obeyed it. The presence of armor no longer determined outcomes. Air dominance did. By mid-afternoon, Panzer Group West had lost its defining characteristic: mobility. What remained was a collection of immobile strongpoints under an enemy-controlled sky. The offensive was still technically underway. In reality, it had already failed. What crushed the German counterattack was not simply aircraft in the sky. It was the integration between air power and ground observation that turned the battlefield into a closed system. By August 1944, the Allies had perfected a method of war that Germany could neither replicate nor disrupt. Forward air controllers were embedded with American ground units on high ground overlooking the battlefield. Their job was simple: watch, report, and direct destruction. Every German movement, every column leaving cover, every attempt to regroup was observed and transmitted in real time. Coordinates were relayed directly to Allied air control centers without delay or confusion. From there, the response was mechanical. Squadrons were assigned targets based on proximity, availability, and priority. Aircraft launched from forward airfields only minutes away. Pilots received updated coordinates while airborne. Attacks followed within a quarter hour of the initial sighting. This process repeated continuously from dawn until evening. There was no need for dramatic breakthroughs or decisive moments. The system did not seek spectacle. It sought exhaustion. German units were forced into a perpetual cycle of disruption. Advance, strike, halt, scatter, repeat. The Germans had no equivalent structure. Luftwaffe units were distant, fuel-starved, and vastly outnumbered. Coordination between German ground forces and aircraft was slow, unreliable, and often non-existent. Requests for air support arrived too late, if they arrived at all. When German aircraft did appear, they faced overwhelming Allied fighter cover. The asymmetry was absolute. Allied aircraft were part of a coordinated battlefield network. German aircraft, when present, were isolated actors. By late afternoon, German commanders understood that this was not a temporary setback. The air-ground machine ensured that any attempt to restore momentum would be detected and crushed almost immediately. There was no window of opportunity, no gap to exploit. The battle was no longer about tanks versus tanks or infantry versus infantry. It was about whether an army could function under constant surveillance and immediate punishment. Panzer Group West could not. The system had already won. By the end of August 7th, the numerical damage to Panzer Group West told only part of the story. Tanks destroyed or disabled were visible markers of defeat. The real collapse was structural and irreversible. German armored formations lost over half their operational strength in a single day. Some divisions lost closer to 2/3, but even these figures underestimated the damage. Many vehicles counted as operational existed only on paper. Without fuel, ammunition, radios, or command cohesion, they could not fight or maneuver. The German replacement system was already strained beyond recovery. Every tank lost in Normandy represented weeks of production, transport, and preparation. Crews could not be trained overnight. Spare parts were scarce. Fuel was rationed. Even intact vehicles often waited idle for components that would never arrive. Allied losses followed a different logic entirely. Aircraft damaged or destroyed over Mortain were replaced almost immediately. Squadrons maintained operational strength because the industrial system behind them functioned without interruption. Airfields were secure. Supply lines were short. Production exceeded attrition. This imbalance defined the battle's outcome before it began. Germany could not afford a single bad day. The Allies could absorb many. At Mortain, Germany suffered its worst possible day. Support vehicles suffered catastrophic losses. Fuel trucks burned. Ammunition carriers vanished. Command vehicles were destroyed. These losses mattered more than tanks because they erased the ability to fight tomorrow, not just today. A panzer division without logistics was not a weakened force. It was a dead one. By evening, German commanders understood the reality. Requests to consolidate, withdraw, or reposition were denied or ignored. Orders no longer reflected battlefield conditions. The chain of command fractured under pressure. This was the final consequence of industrial imbalance. Germany could still fight battles. It could not recover from them. Mortain was not a defeat that could be repaired. It was a condition that could not be reversed. And the war would soon make that clear. By August 1944, Allied air power was no longer just supporting the battlefield. It was the battlefield. What happened at Mortain was not an anomaly. It was the mature form of a system the Allies had spent years building. Air superiority was no longer about dogfights or bomber raids. It was about denying the enemy the ability to move, resupply, or even exist in daylight. German armored doctrine depended on mobility. Tanks were meant to maneuver, concentrate, exploit breakthroughs, then disengage. Allied air power erased every one of those assumptions. Roads became kill zones. Columns became targets. Any movement longer than a few minutes invited destruction. Forward air controllers embedded with American units turned the battlefield into a live map. German positions were reported in near real time. Aircraft were vectored directly onto them. The response cycle, from detection to impact, was often measured in minutes, not hours. German units tried to adapt. They moved at night, dispersed into hedgerows, camouflaged vehicles with branches and nets. None of it worked. The terrain trapped them. Movement revealed them. Air reconnaissance saw everything. The psychological effect was devastating. Tank crews described the sensation of being hunted rather than fighting. Engines were kept off to avoid detection. Crews abandoned vehicles at the first sound of aircraft. Morale collapsed not because men lacked courage, but because courage had become irrelevant. For the Allies, air power multiplied ground strength exponentially. A single infantry unit with air support could halt an entire armored division. Firepower no longer needed mass on the ground. It only needed coordination. This shift marked the end of traditional armored warfare in Western Europe. The tank was no longer the dominant weapon. Control of the sky determined everything beneath it. At Mortain, German armor didn't lose to better tactics or superior crews. It lost to a system that made maneuver impossible. Once the sky belonged to the Allies, the outcome of the campaign was already decided. What destroyed the German counterattack at Mortain did not originate on the battlefield. It originated thousands of miles away, inside factories, rail yards, oil fields, and training pipelines Germany could no longer protect. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was already broken, not tactically, but mathematically. Germany could still build aircraft. It could still design capable fighters. What it could not do was replace losses at the rate required to contest Allied air power. Every Typhoon shot down was replaced in days. Every German aircraft lost took weeks. Pilot losses were even worse. Allied pilots rotated through structured training systems with fuel, aircraft, and instructors in abundance. German pilots were rushed into combat with shrinking flight hours, often flying their first missions directly into airspace they could not survive. Fuel shortages accelerated the collapse. Training flights were canceled. Pilots learned combat maneuvers in classrooms instead of the air. Engines sat idle. Aircraft remained grounded not because they were damaged, but because there was nothing to pour into their tanks. Meanwhile, Allied production scaled relentlessly. Aircraft were standardized, simplified, and mass-produced. Spare parts flowed faster than damage reports. Losses were expected, budgeted, and absorbed. This imbalance turned every engagement into a one-sided exchange. Germany needed near-perfect outcomes just to maintain parity. The Allies could accept failure, absorb it, and continue advancing. At Mortain, this reality became impossible to ignore. German commanders were not fighting Allied units. They were fighting a machine that regenerated faster than it could be damaged. Even flawless tactics could not overcome that gap. Even total bravery could not close it. By the time the counterattack stalled, the German high command understood the truth they could no longer fix. The war had become a contest of replacement rates, and Germany had already lost. The battlefield was only delivering the message. By the evening of August 7, 1944, the Mortain counterattack was over, but the war had already crossed a threshold long before the last tank stopped burning. What Germany encountered that day was not defeat in the traditional sense. It was obsolescence. The German army still had capable soldiers, it still had skilled commanders, it still had weapons that, on paper, could destroy anything the Allies fielded. None of that mattered anymore. The structure that once allowed those strengths to function had collapsed. Modern war had evolved faster than German doctrine could adapt. The battlefield was no longer defined by courage, maneuver, or even firepower. It was defined by systems, logistics, production, coordination, and replacement. Germany had entered a war that required abundance with an economy built for scarcity. Every loss at Mortain carried a cost Germany could not recover. A destroyed tank meant weeks of production. A lost aircraft meant a pilot who could not be replaced. A burned fuel truck meant formations that would never move again. The Allies absorbed those same losses as routine friction. This is why the battle mattered. Mortain was the moment German commanders openly acknowledged that daylight operations were impossible. Movement meant destruction. Concentration meant annihilation. Even retreat required permission from the sky. From that point forward, the German army in the West was no longer an offensive force. It was a delaying force, trading space for time in a war time could no longer save. The lesson of Mortain is brutal in its simplicity. Wars are not won by who fights harder. They are won by who can endure loss longer. Germany could not. By 1944, the factories had already decided the outcome. The battlefield was only catching up. Mortain did not end the war. It proved that the ending was unavoidable.